Hello and welcome to this 7th session in the module Working with Children, Families and Their Carers. Today we're going to be looking at some of the important events over the last 20 years or so that influenced policy development relating to children and families. This session was structured initially around a group task where groups were asked to locate each of these 16 white cards in a chronological order. After groups had more or less success at locating the various events along a continuum, we explored them with the use of this presentation. The first event was the creation of Dr. Barnardo's in 1867. There are clickable links on the presentation which is hosted alongside this video, which you can look at in your own time to understand a bit more of the detail and background of these key events. Dr. Barnardo's was one of the first organisations to intervene into the private realm of family life, and Dr. Barnardo's actually removed children from their birth families and in some cases sent them to live overseas with other families in places such as Australia. And you might consider, is that behaviour actually abusive? The next card was the Children Act 1989, and there was already a date on this act which is now 21 years old, and this piece of legislation was important because it took all the other pieces of legislation that related to children and tried to bring them together in one single act. As policy has developed since 1989, the government has legislated and made other pieces of legislation such as the Child Care Act 2006 and so on. And we're getting to a situation again where there are lots of different acts and pieces of legislation that exist that relate to children, and that creates a difficulty for professionals in that they are not sure of which act to find a particular relevant piece of provision. There was a discussion in class where we made the distinction between legislation and case law. When we talk about legislation, we're talking about things that are called acts. Case law is not legislation. It's also worth pointing out that the plural of legislation is legislation. Students continue to make the mistake of referring to legislations as the plural. This is not the case. The killers of Jamie Bulger in 1993 were Robert Thompson and John Venables, and for various reasons which you can research for yourselves, this case was a landmark case for a number of reasons in the way that we thought about children, culpability and the role of the media and wider social views of what we consider to be childhood. You can look at the timeline of the Jamie Bulger killing on this link and also explore some of the background into Thompson and Venables and the kinds of environments that they came from and perhaps how they were shaped by those environments. New Labour came into power in 1997. It marked a sea change as well in the development of policy and state intervention into family life, in stark contrast to the way that the Conservatives, who had been in power since 1979 to 1997, had legislated on behalf of and affecting families. The coalition government of the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats came into power in May of this year, and we're already starting to see some of the changes that are being implemented in children and families policy as a result of them taking office. The Data Protection Act 1998 is significant because the Data Protection Act is often misunderstood by professionals that work with children and families, and sometimes the Data Protection Act can be used as a hindrance to effective multi-agency working. And it's worth pointing out at this moment in time that the Children Act 1989 always takes precedence over the Data Protection Act. In other words, if a practitioner has concerns about the welfare or well-being of a child, another practitioner cannot refuse to provide information that might continue to place that child at risk by citing they are adhering to the provisions in the Data Protection Act. The Human Rights Act is another piece of legislation which came out in 1998 but wasn't actually enacted. That means it didn't take effect until the year 2000. You can look in more detail at the articles of the Human Rights Act 1998 and how it seeks to give intention to the European Convention on Human Rights. Of particular importance is Article 8, the right to a family life, and how Article 8 is often used by families to oppose the interventions of services such as social services and school and support services, which they might see as unnecessarily interfering into private life. For our purposes, the Human Rights Act is interesting for a number of reasons, but two are that the fact is that it's only been around for 10 years, which is a relatively short period of time, and many of us thought that the Human Rights Act had been around for much longer than this. So ingrained is our talk of rights in a sociological sense. And secondly, you might think of what would be the implications of the Human Rights Act being in existence when Dr. Bernardo's was doing his work. Would families perhaps have called on the provisions of Article 8 to prevent Dr. Bernardo intervening into their family lives and perhaps removing children and sending them to places like Australia? Victoria Climbié was a tragedy that had far-reaching effects, and it's now 10 years since that tragedy. You can read the timeline in more detail by clicking the BBC link there. Unrelated to the death of Victoria Climbié, but only 4 months after that tragedy, the Department of Health published the assessment of children in need and their families. You can click on this link here to read more about that guidance. The Department of Health guidance is the most influential piece of guidance that influences the way that social workers and social services undertake assessments. And those assessments are centred around the assessment triangle, and we'll look at assessments in more detail in another session in the course. It's worth pointing out at this stage that a simplified version of the assessment of children in need is what contributed towards the Common Assessment Framework, which is another card that we'll see later on in this presentation. As the result of Ian Huntley's murder of 2 schoolgirls in Soham, it threw up a number of questions that were asked about the success of information transfer and multi-agency working, and the fact that if certain agencies had known more about the background of Ian Huntley, which was available in other agencies, he would never have got a job as a caretaker in the school where he was able to murder Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. As a result of the Soham murders was an increased diligence and tightening up of the CRB, the Criminal Records Bureau checks that those people who work with vulnerable people must undertake. Three years after the death of Victoria Climbié, Lord Laming published the first report known as the Laming Report in 2003. And you can read about the details of that report by clicking this link, the first Laming Report. There has been a second Laming report. There was a second Laming report published in 2008 which examined the death of baby P. It's important not to confuse the findings of the 2003 and 2008 Laming reports because the findings were slightly different. As a result of the Laming report, the government thought it was important to implement the findings of this very extensive inquiry, the Laming inquiry. And on the back of that inquiry, they developed the green paper Every Child Matters and the massive agenda that became the Every Child Matters agenda. And you can find out more about that on the DCSF site by clicking that link there. As already mentioned, the Common Assessment Framework was influenced by the Department of Health Triangle, and the Common Assessment Framework is a more simplified version but relies on the same principles outlined in the Department of Health version. And those projects were trialled in 2005 with the intention that all agencies ought to be using the Common Assessment Framework by 2006. And you can click on this link here to find out more about the CAF. Up until 2006, relevant agencies would come together under the auspices of the Area Child Protection Committee. Contributions to Area Child Protection Committees were seen as good practice, but the Children Act 2004 created the need for a statutory, i.e. a legal basis for the multi-agency arrangement for the protection of children, and therefore the Children Act 2004 Section 32 stipulated that each local authority and partner agencies must create a local Safeguarding Children's Board by the 1st of April 2006. The Department of Children, Schools and Families was created in 2007, and here you can read an article about what the DCSF set out to do, which was pejoratively referred to as the Department of Curtains and Soft Furnishings. It's actually, in reality, the Department for Children, Schools and Families, and this was brought to an end with the election of the Conservative Lib Dem coalition, which have now hived off the part of the DCSF that dealt with education and created the separate Department of Education. It's been over 3 years now since the Peter Connolly tragedy, and there are various sources here that you can look at in your own time, including an audio clip where you can listen to a discussion on whether or not Baby P's mother should be named, and you're requested to listen to that and come to the following session with some views on what you think about the naming of Baby P's mother in the media and whether you think that was the correct thing or not. In a previous session I had given you this clue that the most recent copy of Working Together was published in 2010, and you can click on this link here at the Department of Education and download the full version of Working Together, which runs to a number of pages. However, I think for our purposes it's worth making these 2 points. Firstly, that Working Together is the guidance that outlines the way in which services should work together in order to promote the welfare and safeguard children. But also, interestingly, from my point of view, that this piece of guidance now sits within the Department of Education, and perhaps would it make more sense sitting within the more holistic department of the previous Department for Children, Schools and Families, given that Working Together should cover all aspects of children's lives, not just their lives within the education setting. That concludes this presentation on some of the key events and policy milestones that have developed, especially over the last 10 years, but also within a context of maybe 20 years and going as far back as Dr. Bernardo's in the 1800s. Some of the key questions that I'd like you to think about is, how is it that services can legitimately intervene into private family life? And what do we think about policy that gives power to different organisations to intervene into family life? Should family life be something that is sacred and separate from the interference of various state bodies, such as social services departments, which are given powers by legislation and supporting policy? Furthermore, should policy determine all elements of practice, or is policy there as a safety net or a framework, but practice should occur on an individual level, i.e. that it's the individual's decision making that should influence how they act rather than adherence to some policy. Thank you, and that concludes this presentation.